The morning of March 10th, 1945, begins in silence. In the smoldering ruins of what had been Tokyo's Shitamachi district, 24-year-old Yoshiko Hashimoto stands knee-deep in the frigid waters of the Sumida River, clutching her infant son. Around her float the bodies of perhaps 10,000 people who sought refuge in this same water just hours before. Her mother is among them. The baby's eyes stare wide and unblinking at a sky still thick with smoke. Above the city, the last of more than 300 American B-29 Superfortresses are disappearing toward the south, their aluminum bellies reflecting the orange glow of 16 square miles of burning city. Yoshiko doesn't yet know that she has survived the deadliest air raid in human history. She doesn't know that 100,000 people died in the firestorm that raged for less than 3 hours. What she knows is simpler and more terrible. Yesterday, Tokyo existed. This morning, it doesn't. The Japanese had been promised that this would never happen. Their military leaders had assured them that the home islands were beyond the reach of American bombers. Even when the B-29 seconds began appearing in late 1944, even when smaller raids burned neighborhoods and killed hundreds, the message remained the same. Japan's air defenses were strong. The Americans couldn't sustain a campaign against the homeland. Victory, while perhaps delayed, was still inevitable. Every one of those promises turned to ash in a single night. This isn't just the story of how America developed a weapon that could erase cities. It's the story of how an entire nation's understanding of war, safety, and their own place in the conflict collapsed faster than the wooden buildings that made up 98% of Tokyo. In 72 hours, the calculus of the Pacific War would fundamentally change, not because of any battle at sea or advance across an island, but because Curtis LeMay proved that he could kill 100,000 people before breakfast and do it again the next night if necessary. To understand the shock, you must first understand what the Japanese believed in early March 1945. Despite losing territory across the Pacific, despite food rationing that left civilians perpetually hungry, despite American submarines strangling their supply lines, most Japanese still clung to a fundamental assumption. The home islands were safe. This wasn't wishful thinking. It was based on geography, on the proven limitations of American air power, and on the demonstrated effectiveness of Japanese air defenses. For 3 years of war, that assumption had held true. The Doolittle raid of April 1942 had been a propaganda stunt, 16 medium bombers launched from an aircraft carrier, causing minimal damage before fleeing to China. It proved that Tokyo could be reached, but also that such raids were desperate one-off gestures, not sustainable campaigns. The Japanese had watched American bombers pound Germany from bases in England, just hours away. Tokyo was separated from the nearest American bases by an ocean. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Then came the B-29 Superfortress, and with it, a new kind of threat. The Boeing B-29 was unlike any aircraft the world had seen. Pressurized cabins that allowed the crew to operate at altitudes above 30,000 feet without oxygen masks. Remote-controlled gun turrets coordinated by a central fire control system. 4 massive Wright R3350 engines that could push the aircraft to speeds over 240 miles per hour. And most importantly, the range to fly from the Mariana Islands, 1,500 miles of open ocean, strike targets in Japan, and return home. The first B-29 to overfly Tokyo came on November 1st, 1944. It was a reconnaissance aircraft, photographing industrial facilities and urban areas in preparation for the bombing campaign to come. Japanese anti-aircraft gunners tracked it across the sky but couldn't touch it. At 32,000 feet, it was simply beyond reach. That first overflight should have terrified Japanese commanders. Instead, it reassured them. The Americans could reach Tokyo, yes. But look at the altitude they had to fly. Look at the conditions they faced. Japanese meteorologists understood something the Americans were only beginning to discover. At high altitudes over Japan, wind speeds frequently exceeded 150 miles per hour, sometimes reaching 250. These weren't normal winds. They were a global atmospheric phenomenon that wouldn't be fully understood or mapped for years. Today, we call it the jet stream. In late 1944, American bombardiers just knew that their bombs were missing targets by miles, scattered by winds they couldn't predict or compensate for. Japanese commanders watched the results of early raids with growing confidence. The Americans were dropping bombs, certainly, but they weren't hitting anything important. High-altitude precision bombing, the doctrine that had worked in Europe against German factories built of steel and concrete, was proving useless against Japan. On November 24, 1944, the 21st Bomber Command launched its first major raid against Tokyo. 111 B-29 seconds were dispatched to bomb the Nakajima Aircraft Company's Musashi engine plant. Only 24 bombers actually released their loads over the target area. Fierce headwinds forced many to turn back. Those that reached Tokyo found their bombs scattered harmlessly across the countryside by the jet stream. Reconnaissance photos showed that only 16 bombs had actually hit anywhere near the factory complex. The plant continued full production. Major General Haywood Hansell, commanding the 21st Bomber, command from his headquarters on Guam, was a true believer in precision bombing. He had helped develop the doctrine in the 1930s, had proven it over Europe, and refused to abandon it now. Through December and into January, his B-29 seconds continued flying high-altitude daylight missions against specific industrial targets. The results were consistently disappointing. Japanese civilians in Tokyo began to develop a strange routine. Air raid sirens would wail. People would dutifully file out of their homes toward designated shelters, mostly just reinforced dugouts or schools with concrete walls. The B-29 seconds would pass overhead, silver dots against the blue sky trailing white contrails. Bombs would fall, explosions would echo across the city, and when the all-clear sounded, people would emerge to find that once again, the Americans had mostly hit empty fields or residential areas nowhere near their intended targets. Yes, people died in these raids, hundreds, sometimes over 1,000, in a single attack. But Tokyo was a city of more than 4 million. The casualties, while tragic, seemed manageable. The industrial capacity that the Americans were supposedly targeting remained largely intact. The war would continue. Japan would endure. This conviction was reinforced by what Japanese civilians could see with their own eyes. The fire raids hadn't started yet. The bombs falling on Tokyo in late 1944 and early 1945 were mostly conventional high explosives, designed to destroy factories and infrastructure. Against a city built primarily of wood and paper, they were relatively ineffective. A 500-pound bomb creates a crater and destroys whatever structure it directly hits. But wooden buildings don't shatter like concrete. They splinter, collapse, but neighbouring structures remain standing. Fires start but are containable by the city's fire brigades, which by early 1945 had become quite experienced at fighting incendiary blazes. Japanese civil defense doctrine emphasized this. Neighborhood firefighting associations, called tonarigumi, drilled constantly. Every household had buckets, sand, and basic firefighting equipment. The theory was that if bombs started fires, local residents would extinguish them before they spread. This system had worked reasonably well through the conventional raids. What Japanese planners failed to anticipate was that the Americans were about to stop trying to destroy specific targets and start trying to destroy entire cities. The weapon that would accomplish this wasn't a breakthrough in explosive power or bombing accuracy. It was simpler, more visceral, and far more terrible. It was fire, delivered on an industrial scale by a device nicknamed the Tokyo Calling Card. The M69 incendiary bomblet looked harmless, almost crude. A hexagonal steel pipe 3 inches in diameter and 20 inches long, weighing just 6 pounds. 38 of these bomblets were packed into an E-46 cluster bomb, which would split open at 2,000 feet, releasing its payload to fall individually. Each M69 had a 3-foot cotton streamer that oriented it nose down during descent. When it hit a rooftop or the ground, a 3 to 5 second fuse would ignite, and then a small explosive charge would blast the incendiary filling, napalm, in flaming globs up to 100 feet in every direction. The napalm was the key. Unlike thermite or magnesium, which burned intensely but could be smothered or scraped away, napalm was jellied gasoline that stuck to surfaces and burned at 1800 degrees. It would adhere to wood, to fabric, to human skin. Water didn't extinguish it. Sand didn't smother it. It simply burned until all the fuel was consumed. The M69 had been developed by the Standard Oil Development Company in collaboration with Harvard University researchers. They had tested it at Dugway Proving Ground in Utah against mock-ups of typical Japanese residential structures, complete with tatami mats, paper screens, and wooden walls. The test results were extraordinary. The M69 achieved a 68% ignition rate against Japanese-style buildings, compared to just 30% for traditional incendiary bombs. In December 1944 and January 1945, American planners began serious discussion of shifting from precision bombing to area incendiary attacks. The arguments were both practical and strategic. Practically, high-altitude precision bombing wasn't working. The jet stream, cloud cover over Japan, and the difficulty of hitting small targets from 6 miles up had resulted in a bombing accuracy rate below 10%. Millions of dollars of ordnance and dozens of air crews were being spent to achieve minimal damage. Strategically, American intelligence had identified a vulnerability in Japanese industrial production that conventional bombing couldn't exploit. Over 50% of Tokyo's manufacturing capacity wasn't concentrated in large factories. It was dispersed throughout residential neighborhoods in thousands of small workshops and cottage industries. A housewife might spend her days assembling electronics components for radar sets. A small machine shop between two homes might produce precision parts for aircraft engines. This decentralized production was remarkably resilient to conventional bombing. You could destroy a dozen random factories and barely impact overall output because hundreds of small operations would continue working. But what if you didn't target factories at all? What if you targeted the neighborhoods where the workers lived and these cottage industries operated? What if you created fires so intense and so widespread that entire sections of the city simply ceased to exist? That was the logic that led to Operation Meeting House. In January 1945, Major General Curtis LeMay replaced Hansel as commander of the 21st Bomber Command. LeMay was 38 years old, a veteran of the strategic bombing campaign over Europe, and a man with a reputation for two things: tactical brilliance and absolute ruthlessness. He looked at the results of high-altitude precision bombing against Japan and made a decision that would define the final months of the Pacific War. He was going to burn Japan's cities to the ground. LeMay's plan represented a complete reversal of American bombing doctrine. Instead of daylight raids at 30,000 feet, his B-29 seconds would attack at night between 5,000 and 9,000 feet. Instead of precision bombing of industrial targets, they would conduct area attacks against entire neighborhoods. Instead of high-explosive bombs, they would drop incendiaries. And in the most controversial decision, to maximize bomb loads, he ordered that all defensive armament except tail guns be removed from the B-29 seconds. This last decision shocked his crews. Stripped of their defensive guns, the Superfortresses would be nearly helpless if Japanese fighters caught them. LeMay's reasoning was coldly logical. Japanese fighters were ineffective at night. Their pilots lacked training in night interception, and ground controllers had limited radar coverage. Japanese anti-aircraft artillery was optimized for high-altitude defense and relatively weak at low altitudes. The real threat wasn't enemy action. It was fuel consumption and the structural stress of long-range missions at high altitude. By flying lower and lighter, his bombers could carry more incendiaries and have better odds of making it home. The target LeMay selected for his first major incendiary raid was carefully chosen. A rectangular area, approximately 3 miles by 4 miles, in Tokyo's Shitamachi district, encompassing the Asakusa, Honjo, and Fukagawa wards. This area was one of the most densely populated urban zones on Earth, with an estimated 750,000 people living in roughly 12 square miles. It was also identified by American intelligence as containing a high concentration of small factories and workshops supporting Japan's war effort. The area's vulnerability to fire was well documented. In September 1923, the Great Kanto earthquake had triggered massive firestorms across Tokyo. The Shitamachi district had burned almost completely, killing tens of thousands. Japanese authorities had rebuilt using the same materials and the same construction methods. Wood and paper structures, tightly packed along narrow streets. American fire experts estimated it would take approximately 125 tons of incendiaries per square mile to completely burn out a Japanese urban area. LeMay's plan called for dropping over 1,600 tons in less than 3 hours. The bombardment would be preceded by Pathfinder aircraft that would mark the target zone with incendiaries arranged in a massive X pattern. Subsequent waves would simply bomb the X, ensuring concentrated coverage. On the afternoon of March 9th, crews began briefing for Mission 40, the official designation for what would become Operation Meeting House. The briefing rooms on Guam, Tinian, and Saipan fell silent as officers explained the mission profile. Low-altitude night attack, maximum incendiary loads, guns removed. Target area containing 750,000 civilians. Some crews were shocked. This wasn't what they had trained for. This wasn't precision bombing of military targets. This was deliberately starting a firestorm in a residential area. Others were grimly satisfied. This was what it took to end the war, save American lives by forcing Japan to surrender. LeMay himself reportedly told his staff that if they lost the war, they would all be prosecuted as war criminals for what they were about to do. Then he ordered the mission to proceed. The first B-29 lifted off from Northfield on Guam at 5:36 in the evening on March 9th. It was followed at 1-minute intervals by more than 320 Superfortresses, the largest bomber formation yet assembled in the Pacific. Each aircraft carried approximately 7 tons of incendiaries, a mixture of M69 cluster bombs and some M47 bombs, which were larger 100-pound incendiaries filled with gelid gasoline and white phosphorus. The flight to Tokyo took approximately 6 hours. Crews flew through tropical darkness over empty ocean, navigating by stars and dead reckoning. As they approached Japan from the south, some crews reported seeing a strange orange glow on the horizon, visible from 40 miles away. Pathfinder aircraft had already reached the target and were marking it with incendiaries. The X was burning bright against the Tokyo night, a perfect aiming point visible for miles. In Tokyo, air raid sirens began wailing at 10:30 in the evening. Most residents paid little attention. There had been dozens of air raid warnings in recent months, most resulting in scattered bombing that killed relatively few people. Yoshiko Hashimoto, the young mother in Sumida Ward, heard the sirens but didn't immediately seek shelter. She was nursing her baby, and her family was gathered in their small wooden home, her father, her mother, her sister, all together on what seemed like another ordinary wartime evening. Then they heard the sound. Not the high-altitude drone of B-29 seconds at 30,000 feet, but a deeper, closer roar. The bombers were coming in low, between 5,000 and 7,000 feet, low enough that people on the ground could see their aluminum skin reflecting the growing firelight. The Pathfinder B-29 seconds had done their job perfectly. Starting at 10 minutes past midnight on March 10th, the main bomber force began unloading their incendiary clusters over the marked target zone. The first wave concentrated their drops in the center of the X, ensuring maximum fire density. Over the next 2.5 hours, 279 bombers would drop approximately 1,665 tons of incendiaries, containing well over 500,000 individual M69 bomblets. What happened next defied every assumption Japanese civilians had about air raids. The M69 bomblets didn't just start individual fires. They started thousands of fires simultaneously across multiple square miles. and these fires behaved unlike anything Tokyo's firefighters had ever confronted. The napalm burned so hot that wooden buildings didn't merely catch fire, they exploded into flames. Within minutes of the first bombs falling, entire city blocks were engulfed. The fires began merging, fed by wind conditions that night, gusting between 17 and 28 miles per hour. As the fires grew, they created their own weather. Superheated air rose violently, pulling in cooler air from the surrounding areas. This created a phenomenon firefighters call a conflagration, where separate fires merge into a single, massive blaze that generates its own wind system. In Tokyo, on the night of March 10th, the conflagration became something even more terrible: a firestorm. A true firestorm is a specific meteorological event where fires become so intense that they create hurricane-force winds converging on the center of the burning area. Temperatures in the fire zone can exceed 1800 degrees. The winds can reach speeds of 50 to 70 miles per hour, strong enough to uproot trees, hurl debris like projectiles, and make escape on foot nearly impossible. The firestorm in Tokyo that night generated updrafts powerful enough to buffet B-29 seconds thousands of feet above, throwing some aircraft completely out of control. The heat was so intense that it melted asphalt on the streets, turning roads into rivers of tar. People who tried to run across these streets found their shoes sticking, then melting, then their feet burning. For the 250,000 people trapped in the initial target zone, there was no effective shelter. Basements and concrete shelters became ovens, baking their occupants alive. Schools that had been designated as safe refuges turned into crematoriums. At one elementary school, 200 people crowded into the cement building, believing the solid structure would protect them. When rescuers found them days later, all 200 were dead, their bodies cooked by radiant heat that had penetrated the walls. Yoshiko Hashimoto's family made the decision that saved her life and condemned her mother. As the fires surrounded their neighborhood, her father realized they couldn't survive by staying in their wooden home or seeking shelter in the nearby school. The only escape was water. The Sumida River ran through the district, about a quarter-mile from their house. Her father ordered the family to run for the river. They burst out of their home into a scene from hell. The wind was so strong it nearly knocked them over. Burning debris filled the air, great flaming chunks of wood and paper swirling through the sky. The heat was unbearable, like standing too close to a massive furnace. Yoshiko saw families holding hands, running through the fires. She saw a baby on fire on a mother's back, the mother still running. She saw children on fire, but still moving forward, driven by some primal survival instinct that kept their legs pumping even as their bodies burned. They reached the river to find thousands of others had the same idea. The water was already choked with people. Her father looked at Yoshiko, who was a strong swimmer, looked at the infant she was carrying, and made a decision. He told her to jump into the river with the baby. Yoshiko hesitated. It was March. The water would be freezing. The baby might not survive. Her mother solved the dilemma. She removed her protective hood, a padded covering that was part of standard civil defense equipment, and placed it on Yoshiko's head. Then she looked into her daughter's eyes. That look conveyed everything. Goodbye. I love you. Save my grandson. Yoshiko jumped into the icy water, clutching her infant son. She managed to reach a wooden raft floating in the river and hauled herself and the baby onto it. Burning logs drifted past in the current. She repeatedly dipped her head under water and splashed water on the baby, trying to keep him cool, terrified by his wide, unblinking stare. Many people clung to the raft. Some simply held on to the sides, treading water. Others had already drowned and floated past, their bodies lit from above by the wall of fire consuming the city. Yoshiko never saw her mother again. She would later learn that without the protective hood, her mother's hair caught fire almost immediately. She died somewhere in the inferno, probably within minutes of sending her daughter to safety. The Sumida River itself became a mass grave. Tens of thousands of people sought refuge in the water that night. Many drowned, pushed under by the desperate press of others trying to reach safety. Others died from hypothermia in the freezing water. Still others were killed by burning debris falling from the sky or by smoke inhalation as the firestorm sucked oxygen out of the air, even over the water. The exact number who died in the river will never be known. Bodies were recovered for weeks afterward. Some estimates suggest 10,000 drowned or burned in the water alone. For the B-29 crews overhead, the raid was surreal. They had expected to drop their bombs and leave. Instead, they flew through a city transformed into a vision of apocalypse. The smoke rose so high that bombers at 7,000 feet were flying through it, the acrid smell of burning wood and worse filling their aircraft through open bomb bay doors. The heat from the fires below created turbulence that tossed the heavy bombers around like toys. Several crews reported seeing the fires reflecting off their aluminum fuselages, turning their aircraft orange against the black sky. One crew member later described being able to read a newspaper in the cockpit from the firelight below. Martin Sheridan, a Boston Globe war correspondent flying aboard one of the B-29 seconds, wrote that the navigator didn't even need to give bearings to Tokyo because 40 miles out, they could see the reddish glow on the horizon. Up close, the scene was worse. Sheridan watched through the bombardier's window as entire neighborhoods vanished in flames. The city's layout, visible in previous reconnaissance photos, was disappearing under a blanket of fire and smoke. Later, bombers in the formation had difficulty even identifying the aiming point. The Pathfinder X had been consumed by the general conflagration. Bombardiers simply dropped their loads into the center of the burning area, adding more incendiaries to fires that no longer needed any help. Back at 21st Bomber Command headquarters on Guam, Curtis LeMay waited for the strike reports. The first returning bombers began landing just before dawn. Crews were exhausted, shaken by what they had witnessed, but the reports were clear. Tokyo was burning. Reconnaissance aircraft flying over the city at first light photographed the results. Where the Shitamachi district had been, where 750,000 people had lived and worked the previous day, there was now a flat expanse of ash and rubble extending over nearly 16 square miles. The few structures still standing were hollow shells, their walls cracked, their windows blown out. The total destruction was so complete that later analysts would compare it to the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Indeed, by some measures, Operation Meeting House was more destructive than either atomic bombing. The death toll was higher, the area destroyed was larger. The psychological impact on Japanese civilians was, if anything, more severe because unlike the atomic bombs, which came later and were at least novel and incomprehensible, the Tokyo firebombing proved that American bombers could reduce their cities to ashes using conventional weapons. If this could happen in Tokyo, it could happen anywhere. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. LeMay's initial reaction to the strike reports was cautious satisfaction. He told reporters at a press conference hours after the raid, "This looks like the most successful attack we have made to date. Don't get too enthusiastic until we see the photographs." But the photographs, when they came, exceeded even his expectations. In a single night, with a loss of 14 B-29 seconds and 96 airmen, American bombers had destroyed approximately 25% of Tokyo's industrial capacity, had killed an estimated 100,000 civilians, and had rendered more than 1 million people homeless. Perhaps more importantly, the raid had demonstrated that Japan's cities were defenseless against incendiary attack. The high-altitude bombing campaign had allowed Japanese leaders to maintain the narrative that the home islands were protected. Operation Meeting House destroyed that narrative in 3 hours. For the Japanese military and government, the Tokyo firebombing represented a strategic nightmare they had no answer for. Civil defense plans assumed fires could be contained by local firefighting brigades. The firestorm had overwhelmed those defenses instantly. Anti-aircraft artillery had proven largely ineffective against low-flying aircraft at night. Fighter intercept ions had been minimal. The B-29 seconds had attacked with near impunity, faced more danger from turbulence caused by their own fires than from Japanese defenses. And most terrifying of all, this wasn't a one-time attack. The bombers came from the Mariana Islands, where the Americans had multiple airfields and hundreds of B-29 seconds. They could do this again, tomorrow, every night, until nothing remained of Japan's cities but radioactive ash and the memories of those who once lived there. The assumptions that had sustained Japanese morale through years of defeat were evaporating as quickly as the water in Tokyo's canals under the 1800-degree heat of napalm fires. The morning of March 10th found Tokyo transformed. Yoshiko Hashimoto climbed out of the Sumida River as dawn broke, still clutching her infant son. Around her, the riverbanks were lined with bodies. The all-clear sirens had sounded at 2:37 in the morning. The fires burned for several more hours. As she walked away from the river, she entered a landscape that no longer resembled the city she knew. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to ash. In some areas, the fire had burned so hot that bodies had been cremated where they fell, leaving only blackened stains on the ground. In other places, people had died huddled together, their bodies fused by the heat into grotesque sculptures. The few surviving structures stood like broken teeth against a grey sky. Smoke continued to rise from smouldering rubble. The smell was indescribable, a mixture of burning wood, chemicals from destroyed factories, and charred flesh. That smell would persist for weeks, a constant reminder of what had happened. Survivors wandered the ruins in shock, many suffering from severe burns. There were no ambulances, no organized rescue efforts in the first hours. Tokyo's civil defense system had been designed to handle localized damage, not citywide catastrophe. Hospitals that were still standing were overwhelmed within hours. Doctors and nurses worked without adequate supplies, without electricity in many areas, treating injuries they had never been trained to handle. Napalm burns were different from conventional fire burns. The jelly had adhered to skin and clothing, burning deep into tissue. Many victims had inhaled superheated air, searing their lungs. Others suffered from smoke inhalation or carbon monoxide poisoning, and thousands more were simply dying from shock and exposure. The temperature that March night had been near freezing. People who had jumped into the river to escape the fires now faced hypothermia. Those who had lost their homes had no shelter, as dawn revealed the full extent of the destruction. Relief efforts were chaotic and inadequate. The Japanese government had not prepared for a disaster of this scale. Food distribution broke down immediately. Water supplies were contaminated or destroyed. Electricity and gas were cut off across large sections of the city. In the immediate aftermath, survivors were forced to rely on themselves and whatever informal community support networks still functioned. Lars Tillitse, a Danish diplomat who lived in Tokyo, survived the firebombing and later described the hardships that followed. Fire brigades had tried desperately to control the blazes, he wrote, but wave after wave of incendiaries had overwhelmed them. When the fires were finally extinguished, 100,000 were dead and 1 million were homeless. In the days after the attack, men, women and children who had lost their homes walked the streets carrying whatever belongings they had managed to salvage, with nowhere to sleep. Access to basic amenities like gas, electricity, telecommunications and water was almost entirely non-existent. The destruction extended beyond physical infrastructure. Tokyo's transportation system was shattered. Trains couldn't run through burned-out sections of track. Roads were blocked by rubble or rendered impassable by melted asphalt. Food supplies, already stretched thin by years of war and American submarine blockade, collapsed entirely in the affected areas. The government's rationing system assumed functioning distribution networks. Those networks no longer existed. Finding adequate food became an immediate crisis for survivors. Government rations had never been sufficient to sustain people properly, and now the black market, which many had relied on to supplement their diets, saw prices inflate to levels that made food unaffordable for most. Many survivors began evacuating the city to stay with relatives in the countryside. The exodus was difficult because no official Japanese evacuation plan had been put into place. Trains could only accommodate a small percentage of those trying to leave, so the roads filled with a great migration of homeless people, carrying whatever remained of their possessions on bicycles, handcarts, or their backs. Katsumoto Saotome was 12 years old when the firebombing destroyed his neighborhood. Decades later, he would describe the world through a red filter that night, the flames so bright and pervasive that everything took on a crimson hue. He described the fire as living, the way it spread with apparent intelligence, seeking out fuel, jumping across streets, racing through wooden structures faster than people could run. His family fled to the Sumida River like thousands of others. They survived, but the memory would define the rest of his life. He would later found the center of the Tokyo raids and war damage, dedicating himself to preserving survivor testimonies and ensuring that what happened would not be forgotten. But Operation Meeting House was not the end. It was the beginning. Curtis LeMay had proven his concept. Incendiary raids worked. On March 11th and 12th, just 2 days after Tokyo, 130 B-29 seconds attacked Nagoya, Japan's third-largest city and a major industrial center. The raid destroyed approximately 2 square miles of the city. On March 13th and 14th, it was Osaka's turn. 274 B-29 seconds burned out more than 8 square miles. On March 16th and 17th, Kobe, Japan's 6th-largest city and a major port, was hit by 297 bombers. 3 square miles went up in flames. On March 18th and 19th, Nagoya was struck again, this time by 290 superfortresses, burning another 3 square miles. In 6 days, 5 of Japan's largest cities were devastated by firebombing. The Japanese military and civilian population watched helplessly as American bombers operated with near impunity. Air raid sirens became a constant presence in daily life. Civilians who had initially ignored them, grown complacent by months of ineffective high-altitude raids, now fled to shelters every time the warning sounded. But shelters offered little protection against firestorms. People began evacuating cities voluntarily, without government orders or assistance. By late March 1945, more than 8 million Japanese civilians had fled urban areas for the countryside. This mass migration created its own humanitarian crisis. Rural areas lacked the infrastructure to absorb millions of refugees. Food production in the countryside was already strained. Now, villagers who had barely enough to feed themselves were expected to house and feed urban refugees who brought nothing but the clothes on their backs. The psychological impact on Japanese civilians was profound and multifaceted. Before March 10th, most Japanese believed, or at least hoped, that the war might end in some form of negotiated settlement. Perhaps they would lose some territory, make some concessions, but the home islands would remain Japanese, the people would survive, life would eventually return to something resembling normal. The firebombing campaigns destroyed that hope. If the Americans were willing and able to burn entire cities, to kill hundreds of thousands of civilians, what reason was there to believe they would stop short of complete annihilation? The bombs demonstrated American material superiority in the most visceral way possible. Japanese propaganda had spent years telling civilians that American soldiers were weak, that American industry produced inferior weapons, that Japanese spirit would ultimately triumph over American wealth. It's difficult to maintain that narrative. When watching your city burn from bombs, you have no way to stop. Some Japanese civilians began questioning not just the war's progress, but the entire rationale for the conflict. If the leadership had been wrong about Japan's ability to defend the home islands, what else had they been wrong about? These doubts remained largely unspoken. Japan's military government tolerated no dissent. The Kempeitai, the military police, arrested anyone suspected of defeatist talk. But privately, in whispered conversations between family members, the questions festered. Haruyo Nihei was 8 years old during the Tokyo firebombing. 70 years later, she would describe the memory as a curse, something she could recall with perfect clarity but wished she could forget. She remembered balls of fire falling from the sky. She remembered her father saying they had to flee their shelter or be cooked alive. She remembered emerging into a world that looked like a flowing river of fire, with burning debris, tatami mats, and clothing flying down the street, driven by winds so powerful they could snatch a baby from a mother's arms. She remembered seeing other families like hers, holding hands and running through the flames. She remembered a baby on fire on a mother's back, still alive, still screaming. She remembered children on fire but still running, their legs pumping mechanically while their bodies burned. These images would stay with her forever, surfacing in nightmares for decades. For Japanese military leaders, the firebombing campaign presented an impossible dilemma. They could not defend against it. Japanese anti-aircraft artillery was optimized for high-altitude defense. Repositioning and retraining units to engage low-flying aircraft at night would take months Japan didn't have. Fighter defenses were similarly inadequate. Japanese pilots lacked training in night operations. The aircraft themselves, many of them outdated designs pressed into service as American advances strangled Japan's industrial capacity, were poorly suited for night interception. Ground-based radar coverage was spotty and unreliable. Even if Japanese fighters managed to intercept the B-29 formations, the superfortresses were heavily armed with remote-controlled turrets and could absorb tremendous damage. A fighter pilot engaging a B-29 at night faced terrible odds. More fundamentally, Japan simply lacked the resources to rebuild what was being destroyed. Each firebombing raid eliminated not just buildings, but the workers who staffed factories, the engineers who maintained equipment, the skilled laborers who produced precision components. You cannot replace experienced machinists or trained technicians quickly. The cottage industries that had allowed Japan to maintain military production despite earlier bombing campaigns were being systematically eliminated. Without those dispersed workshops, large factories lacked the small parts they needed to produce finished weapons. The Imperial Japanese Navy and Army had different reactions to the crisis. The Navy, which had been effectively destroyed as a fighting force by March 1945, recognized that the war was lost. Senior naval officers began quietly discussing surrender terms, though always in private and always with the caveat that any surrender must preserve the emperor's position. The army, which still maintained substantial forces in China and had an intact force structure for defending the home islands, refused to accept defeat. Army commanders argued that the firebombing, while devastating, was not militarily decisive. Yes, civilians were dying and cities were burning, but the armed forces remained capable of fighting. The plan for Ketsu-go, the defense of the Japanese home islands, called for turning the entire nation into a fortress. Every beach would be fortified. Every city would become a battleground. Every civilian would be armed with bamboo spears if necessary. The Americans might burn cities from the air, but if they wanted to occupy Japan, they would have to invade, and that invasion would cost so many American lives that surely, eventually, they would negotiate. This logic was fundamentally disconnected from reality, but it reflected the Army's institutional culture. Surrender was unthinkable. Death was preferable to dishonor. If the nation had to be sacrificed to preserve that principle, so be it. The firebombing continued through April and into May. Tokyo was struck again on April 13th. 327 B-29 seconds targeted the arsenal area, killing 1,662 people and adding to the destruction already inflicted. On April 15th, 109 bombers hit the city again at night, killing 841 and destroying 50,000 more buildings. By late April, the 20th Air Force had run out of incendiary bombs. American factories were producing them as quickly as possible, but LeMay's campaign was consuming ordnance faster than it could be replaced. The brief respite allowed Japanese authorities to attempt evacuation of remaining urban populations and clearing of rubble in already destroyed areas. But the pause was temporary. In May, the incendiaries arrived again, and the campaign resumed with increased intensity. On May 23rd and 24th, 250 B-29 seconds struck the Yamanote area of Tokyo, killing 762 people. On May 25th and 26th, 464 superfortresses attacked the same area, killing 3,352 and destroying 166,000 buildings. Tokyo Station, a symbol of modern Japan, was reduced to a burned-out shell. The Meiji-built main building of the Imperial Palace, though technically not targeted, was destroyed in the fires. By the end of May, Tokyo was 50% destroyed. 4 million people were homeless. The city that had been Japan's capital, its largest urban center, its industrial heart, was functionally dead. And Tokyo was not unique. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama, Kawasaki, and dozens of smaller cities suffered similar fates. The 20th Air Force began running out of major urban targets. By July 1945, Curtis LeMay was ordering raids on cities with populations as small as 30,000, simply because there was nothing larger left to burn. The scale of destruction was historically unprecedented. Modern estimates suggest that between March and August 1945, American firebombing killed between 300,000 and 500,000 Japanese civilians. The Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted after the war, estimated 220,000 dead, but acknowledged that many casualties were never recorded. People who died in firestorms were often cremated where they fell. Families that were completely wiped out left no one to report their deaths. Refugees who died during evacuation were buried in unmarked graves or simply left by the roadside. The number of homeless is more certain. Approximately 13 million Japanese civilians lost their homes to incendiary bombing between March and August 1945. In a nation of roughly 70 million, nearly 1 in 5 people became refugees in their own country. The economic impact was catastrophic. Japan's industrial production had already been declining due to American submarine warfare cutting off raw material imports. The firebombing accelerated the collapse. By July 1945, Japanese war production had fallen to approximately 30% of its 1944 levels. Aircraft production, which had peaked at 28,000 planes in 1944, dropped to fewer than 8,000 in 1945. Most of those were barely flyable, assembled from inferior materials by inexperienced workers in improvised facilities. Emperor Hirohito toured the devastated sections of Tokyo after the May raids. What he saw shocked him profoundly. The emperor lived a sheltered existence. His contact with the war filtered through military briefings and sanitized reports. Walking through the ruins, seeing the homeless survivors, the burned-out shells of buildings, the utter devastation, brought home the reality of Japan's situation in a way no report could. It was during this period that Hirohito began seriously considering surrender. The problem was that any surrender decision required consensus among the Supreme Council for the direction of the war, the 6 most powerful military and civilian leaders. The army representatives on that council, War Minister General Korechika Anami and Army Chief of Staff General Yoshijiro Umezu, would not accept surrender under any circumstances. They continued to insist that Ketsu-go could inflict such terrible casualties on American invasion forces that better terms could be negotiated. The Foreign Minister, Shigenori Togo, and Navy Minister Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai recognized that continued resistance was pointless, but they could not openly advocate surrender without being branded as traitors and possibly assassinated by junior officers who saw any talk of ending the war as betrayal. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki tried to maintain a middle position, neither advocating for continued war nor explicitly calling for surrender. The result was paralysis. Through June and July, as American bombers continued to incinerate Japanese cities, the Supreme Council met repeatedly and accomplished nothing. Meanwhile, the firebombing was having effects beyond simple destruction. Japanese civil society was beginning to collapse. Food distribution systems had broken down in many areas. Starvation, which had been a problem primarily in isolated rural regions, was now affecting urban refugees and even city dwellers in areas that hadn't been bombed. People were eating bark, grass, anything that might provide calories. Malnutrition led to disease. Tuberculosis, dysentery, and other illnesses spread through refugee camps and overcrowded rural areas where urban evacuees had fled. The social fabric that had held Japan together through years of war was fraying. Theft, previously rare in a society that valued honor and obedience, became common. Refugees stole from farms. Soldiers stole from civilians. Black markets, which had operated on the margins, now handled the majority of food transactions at prices that made them accessible only to the wealthy. Trust between citizens and government eroded. Propaganda that assured the people of eventual victory rang hollow when cities were burning and no one was doing anything to stop it. Air raid sirens, which officials insisted people must obey, were often ignored because shelters offered no real protection. Civil defense drills, where civilians practiced fighting fires with buckets of sand, seemed absurd when incendiary raids created firestorms that no amount of buckets could extinguish. For survivors of the firebombings, the psychological trauma was deep and lasting. Unlike soldiers who faced combat and at least understood that they were engaged in warfare against armed opponents, civilians who survived firestorms had experienced something fundamentally different. They had been targeted not because of anything they had done, but simply because they lived in a city that American planners wanted to destroy. They had watched their children burn. They had left family members behind to die. They had made impossible choices about who to save and who to abandon. 8-year-old Haruyo Nihei survived but lost family members. Yoshiko Hashimoto survived but lost her mother, father, and sister. Katsumoto Saotome survived but carried memories that would define the next 70 years of his life. For these survivors and hundreds of thousands like them, the firebombings created what psychiatrists would later term survivor's guilt. Why did I live when so many died? Could I have saved someone I left behind? These questions had no good answers, but they haunted survivors for decades. The trauma was compounded by the Japanese government's response, or rather, its lack of response. No significant assistance was provided to bombing survivors. The government, focused entirely on continuing the war effort, treated civilian casualties as acceptable losses. Veterans of the firebombings received no special status, no compensation, no recognition. After the war, the issue became even more politically complicated. Japan's post-war government, under American occupation and then as an independent nation allied with the United States, was reluctant to discuss the firebombing campaigns in detail. Doing so might create diplomatic tensions with America. It might also raise uncomfortable questions about Japanese leadership's decision to continue the war long after it was clearly lost, thereby allowing the destruction to continue. As a result, survivors' stories were marginalized. School textbooks devoted more attention to the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki than to the conventional firebombings that had killed more people. No national memorial was built to the victims. No government fund compensated those who had lost everything. Survivors were left to process their trauma privately, without official acknowledgement or support. This institutional neglect created its own wound, one that survivors carried alongside their memories of the firestorms. Shizuo Nishio, who was 6 years old during the Tokyo firebombing, survived because her father insisted the family go to a cement school building rather than their wooden home. But the school, packed with 200 people seeking refuge, became a death trap. The fires outside superheated the air inside. All 200 people were cooked alive, steamed to death by radiant heat that penetrated the concrete walls. Shizuo and her mother had left the school to find shelter elsewhere, a random decision that saved their lives. For the B-29 crews who conducted these raids, the psychological impact was different, but no less significant. Some airmen were troubled by what they were doing. They had signed up to bomb military targets, to destroy factories and infrastructure. Flying over Tokyo at 7,000 feet, smelling the smoke of burning flesh drifting up through open bomb bay doors, seeing the firestorms consuming residential neighborhoods, It was impossible to maintain the fiction that this was precision warfare against military targets. Other crewmen took refuge in a kind of moral numbness. This was war. This was what it took to end it. The alternative was an invasion of Japan that might cost 1 million American lives. Better to kill Japanese civilians from the air than to sacrifice American soldiers on the ground. Curtis LeMay himself never expressed regret or doubt about the firebombing campaign. When asked after the war about the morality of deliberately targeting civilians, he responded, "I suppose if I had lost the war, I would have been tried as a war criminal. Fortunately, we were on the winning side." That statement reflected a hard truth. The firebombing of Japanese cities would be judged not by abstract ethical principles, but by the outcome of the war. If it shortened the conflict, saved American lives, and contributed to Japan's surrender, then it would be considered justified. If it had failed to achieve those objectives, it would be remembered as an atrocity. History, as LeMay understood, is written by the victors. By August 1945, Japan's situation was catastrophic. 66 cities had been heavily damaged or destroyed by firebombing. Industrial production had collapsed. Food supplies were critically short. The military, while still intact, lacked the fuel, ammunition, and spare parts necessary to sustain operations. The Soviet Union, which Japan had desperately hoped would mediate a negotiated peace, had instead declared war and invaded Manchuria, destroying the Kwantung Army in a matter of days. Then came the atomic bombs. Hiroshima on August 6th, Nagasaki on August 9th. These attacks killed approximately 150,000 people immediately, with tens of thousands more dying in the months that followed from radiation sickness. The atomic bombs were fundamentally different weapons than the incendiaries that had destroyed Tokyo. They killed through blast, heat, and radiation. A single airplane could destroy an entire city in seconds. There was no defense, no warning, no possibility of shelter. But in a sense, the atomic bombs were not as psychologically shocking to Japanese leaders as they might have been if Operation Meeting House had never happened. Tokyo had been destroyed by conventional weapons. Hiroshima had been destroyed by an atomic weapon. The mechanism was different, but the result was similar. American bombers could erase Japanese cities. That fact had been established in March 1945. What the atomic bombs added was the threat of unlimited devastation with minimal effort. The United States didn't need hundreds of bombers to destroy a city anymore. One plane, one bomb. If the Americans had dozens of these weapons, or hundreds, they could obliterate every remaining Japanese city without risking another pilot. The Supreme Council finally met on August 9th and 10th to discuss surrender. Emperor Hirohito attended the meetings and made an unprecedented decision. He would personally break the deadlock. He spoke of the new bomb's devastating power, of the discrepancy between the military's plans and performance, and ominously of the domestic situation, referring to the danger of internal collapse as starving, homeless civilians lost all faith in their leaders. On August 15th, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the Japanese nation by radio. It was the first time most Japanese had ever heard their emperor's voice. Speaking in formal court Japanese that many listeners struggled to understand, he announced that Japan would accept the Potsdam Declaration. He never used the word surrender. He spoke instead of accepting the joint declaration of the powers and enduring the unendurable. Crucially, he cited the enemy's use of a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to damage is indeed incalculable. He warned that if Japan continued fighting, it would result not only in the collapse of the Japanese nation, but the complete extinction of human civilization. For ordinary Japanese, the emperor's broadcast was shocking on multiple levels. First, the realization that Japan had surrendered. The war they had been told they were winning, the struggle they had been prepared to fight to the death, was over and they had lost. Second, the sound of the emperor's voice itself. The divine figure they had been raised to worship sounded human, frail, mortal. His voice was thin and high-pitched, distorted by poor audio quality. This was God? Finally, the reference to the new bomb. Many Japanese understood that the emperor was speaking of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, though the full extent of the atomic bombing's damage was not yet known to most civilians. But the emperor's language suggested something even more terrible than what they had already experienced. For survivors of the Tokyo firebombing, the surrender was a complex mix of relief and grief. Relief that the bombing would stop, that they might survive, that they wouldn't have to fight to the death with bamboo spears. Grief for everything they had lost, everything that had been destroyed for a war that was now acknowledged as futile. Some felt anger at the military leaders who had continued the war long after it was clearly lost, allowing the firebombing campaigns to kill hundreds of thousands who might have survived if Japan had surrendered earlier. Others felt shame, a deeply ingrained cultural response to defeat that would shape Japan's post-war psychology for generations. The connection between the firebombing campaign and Japan's surrender decision has been debated by historians for decades. Did the conventional bombing force Japan to surrender? Or was it the atomic bombs that were decisive? Or was it the combination of all factors? The firebombing, the atomic bombs, the Soviet entry into the war, the naval blockade, and the looming threat of American invasion? The most honest answer is that all these factors worked together. The firebombing demonstrated that American bombers could operate with impunity over Japan, destroying cities faster than they could be evacuated or rebuilt. It collapsed Japan's industrial capacity and created mass homelessness and starvation that threatened internal stability. It made clear that the planned defense of the home islands was futile because the Americans didn't need to invade. They could simply burn Japan to ashes from the air. The atomic bombs added a new dimension of threat. They proved that the Americans possessed weapons that made even the devastating incendiary raids look conventional. They suggested that the United States could continue destroying cities indefinitely with minimal risk or effort. The Soviet invasion eliminated Japan's last hope for a negotiated settlement and opened a new front that Japan had no resources to defend. Together, these factors created a situation where even the most hardline military leaders could no longer deny reality. Continued resistance wasn't going to produce a better outcome. It was simply going to kill more Japanese for no purpose. The aftermath of the firebombing campaigns shaped post-war Japan in ways that are still visible today. The physical reconstruction took years. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and other bombed cities were rebuilt with modern urban planning, wider streets, more fire-resistant construction. The wooden, tightly packed neighborhoods that had been so vulnerable to firestorms were replaced by concrete and steel structures separated by broad avenues. But the psychological reconstruction took longer and was never entirely complete. Japanese society developed a complex relationship with the memory of the bombing campaigns. On one hand, there was a desire to move forward, to focus on reconstruction and economic development rather than dwelling on wartime trauma. The government emphasized looking ahead, not back. On the other hand, survivors needed acknowledgement. They needed their stories told, their suffering recognized. The tension between these impulses created a fragmented memory landscape. Some neighborhoods erected small memorials to bombing victims. Grassroots organizations like the Center of the Tokyo Raids and War Damage collected survivor testimonies and artifacts. But there was no national museum dedicated to the firebombings, no government compensation for survivors, no official acknowledgement comparable to that given to atomic bomb survivors. This differential treatment created resentment among some firebombing survivors. They had experienced comparable trauma and loss, yet received less recognition simply because they were killed by conventional weapons rather than atomic ones. The debate over the morality of the firebombing campaigns continues. Critics argue that deliberately targeting civilian populations, which is what area incendiary bombing amounts to regardless of official justifications about cottage industries, constitutes a war crime. The fact that similar tactics were condemned when used by Nazi Germany during the Blitz makes the Allied bombing campaigns ethically problematic. Defenders argue that the raids were militarily necessary to force Japan's surrender without an invasion that might have killed millions. They point out that Japan's military had deliberately dispersed war production into residential areas, making precise targeting of purely military objectives impossible. They note that Japanese forces had committed atrocities throughout Asia and showed no inclination to surrender despite losing the war. Both arguments contain elements of truth. The firebombing of Japanese cities was strategically effective. It did contribute to Japan's surrender. It probably did save lives compared to the alternatives available in 1945. It was also a form of warfare that deliberately targeted civilians, caused suffering on a massive scale, and set precedents for future conflicts that are deeply troubling. These moral complexities cannot be easily resolved. They reflect the broader ethical problems of total war in the 20th century, where distinctions between combatants and non-combatants, between military and civilian targets, became increasingly blurred. For the survivors, these debates are abstract. What matters to them is the lived experience. Yoshiko Hashimoto, who jumped into the Sumida River, clutching her infant son, while her mother died in the flames behind her. Haruyo Nihei, who was 8 years old when she saw children on fire but still running, their legs pumping mechanically while their bodies burned. Katsumoto Saotome, who saw the world through a red filter as napalm fires consumed his neighborhood. These survivors became witnesses to history in a way they never chose. They carried memories that nobody should have to carry, of hell made real on earth, of industrial-scale death delivered from the sky, of a night when the assumptions that sustained a nation's morale burned away as quickly as the wooden buildings that had housed millions. The 72 hours that transformed Tokyo from a city of 4 million people to 16 square miles of ash and rubble revealed something fundamental about modern warfare. Technology had advanced to the point where civilian populations could be targeted directly and destroyed wholesale. The firepower to accomplish this existed. The delivery systems to carry it out existed. The strategic logic to justify it existed. The only question was whether nations would use these capabilities. Curtis LeMay answered that question over Tokyo on the night of March 9th and 10th, 1945. He proved that conventional weapons could produce destruction previously associated only with natural disasters or nuclear weapons. He demonstrated that moral constraints that had limited warfare in previous eras could be discarded when military necessity demanded it. The B-29 crews who flew those missions, who smelled burning flesh at 7,000 feet and watched entire neighborhoods vanish in firestorms, learned that modern war had no clear boundaries. The civilians who survived learned that safety was an illusion. The leaders who ordered the raids learned that victory sometimes requires actions that would be called criminal in defeat. And Japan learned that the assumptions they had built their war strategy around, the belief that the home islands were protected, that civilian areas would not be targeted, that American bombers could be stopped, were all catastrophically wrong. Those assumptions didn't crumble slowly over months of accumulated evidence. They disintegrated in 3 hours on a March night when the sky opened and rained fire. The psychological transformation from confidence in eventual victory to acceptance of total defeat, from belief in divine protection to recognition of utter vulnerability, from certainty about one's place in the world to complete disorientation, happened faster than the firestorm that swept across Tokyo's Shitamachi district. 100,000 people died that night. 1 million became homeless. And every Japanese who survived, every person who heard the reports or smelled the smoke or saw the refugees fleeing burned cities, understood that the war they had been told they were winning was not just lost, but had become unwinnable. The Americans hadn't just captured territory or destroyed military forces. They had demonstrated the capability and willingness to exterminate Japanese cities one by one until nothing remained but ash and memory. That demonstration, repeated across 66 cities over 5 months, created the psychological conditions that made surrender possible. The atomic bombs provided the final push, the undeniable proof that resistance was futile. But the groundwork was laid in March 1945, when Curtis LeMay's bombers proved that Japan's cities were made of paper and wood, that they would burn beautifully when touched by napalm, and that there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The Japanese hadn't expected that 2,000 B-29 seconds could flatten Tokyo in 72 hours using incendiary clusters. They had prepared for conventional war, for battles that would be decided by courage and sacrifice, by the strength of the warrior spirit against material wealth. Instead, they experienced industrial-scale annihilation delivered from altitudes where anti-aircraft guns couldn't reach, by weapons that turned entire neighborhoods into crematoriums, in a campaign that killed more Japanese civilians than died in both atomic bombings combined. That shock, that sudden comprehension of how completely their assumptions about the war had been wrong, was perhaps more devastating than the physical destruction. Buildings could be rebuilt, cities could rise from ash. But the psychological certainty that had sustained Japan through years of losing battles, the faith that somehow they would endure and triumph, couldn't survive the night the sky burned red over Tokyo and the Sumida River filled with bodies seeking refuge from fires that had nowhere left to spread because everything was already burning. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.